have our next speaker, Steinburg, who is Mr. Johnny Steinburg. He will be speaking on the views from the Liberian diaspora.
Madam Chair, Commissioners, everybody, thank you very much. It's very good to be here. My name is Johnny Steinburg. I'm a visiting research scholar at the City University of New York, and I am writing an ethnography, a book about a community of Liberians, most of whom were refugees from the Civil War, who live in Staten Island in New York. It's kind of a new adventure for me. My previous work is all about South Africa. My previous books all explore various aspects of everyday life in the wake of South Africa's transition to democracy, from the relationship between the races and the genders, the relationship between state institutions and ordinary people, and what the transition's done in the fabric of everyday life. And I want to speak really wearing two hats today, and the one is as an ethnographer looking at a Liberian community, a Liberian diaspora community, and the other is as a South Africa who has done some study on South Africa's Transition and Truth Commission. I hope that I managed to balance those. Let me begin just by telling you, just describing geographically this community in New York. There's 4,000 Liberians living on one street. It's a street maybe 800 yards long. It's lined by 6-story buildings on each side of the street. They're buildings built for poor people. They're federally subsidized housing projects. And 4,000 Liberians from all across Liberia, from every language group and every ethnic group in Liberia, living side by side and on top of one another on the streets, and dealing with the legacy of the Civil War together. So that's the community that I'm looking at. Just a few words about how this community formed. Liberians the street is called Park Hill Avenue. You've been there, Commissioner. Yes. Liberians began living on Park Hill Avenue, the very first in the late 1970s. At first, just a couple of dozen families. By the late 1980s, a couple of hundred families. And it wasn't a usual Liberian community living in America because it was very poor. This is one of the poorest parts of New York. Their neighbors were largely and underemployed Americans. Most of the Liberians there were blue-collar workers. Many were construction workers. Many were illiterate and therefore couldn't get a driver's license or any qualification in America. Many were undocumented and therefore couldn't work legally in America. So it wasn't your usual Liberian community in America. It was a particularly poor community. War broke out in the end of December 1989. And of course, all of these people at this stage, maybe about 200 families living on Park Hill, had relatives back in Liberia who were forced to flee their homes. Many became refugees and went into the refugee camps in Ivory Coast and Ghana. And in the early 90s, the Lutheran Church approached this community in New York and told them there was an opportunity to bring relatives as refugees to America. And everybody began filing, everybody tried to bring families over. And within a space of 4 years, this community grew from a few hundred to 4,000. So overnight, from a scattering of Liberians, it became a Liberian refugee center and a very displaced community, very traumatized community, living with the legacy of the war. I just want to briefly describe broadly the circumstances in which many refugees arrived in this community. There are hardly any cases of a whole family arriving together. I mean, as you obviously know, families were split by the conflict. I've gathered the testimony of maybe 70, 80 people who arrived in the early 90s, and almost each one of them was split from family on the day that they fled. Had somebody going to a market in the morning and conflict broke out and he couldn't make his way back and didn't see family for 4 or 5 years. Another person who lived in Buchanan went out one morning His house was attacked that morning with his daughter and son-in-law in it. He went to New York alone, and he wasn't reunited with these people for another 7 or 8 years. So many, many people arriving in New York alone. Many children without parents arriving in Staten Island. At one point, there was an apartment on Park Hill Avenue of 15 children without any adults. And these kids would go out roaming at night, largely unsupervised. Many, many apartments with just one person living in them, with single people, young, middle-aged, and old. With husbands and wives either dead or injured or stuck in Liberia or stuck in a refugee camp. And you have this phenomenon of elderly women and men from deep in the interior, from Nimba or Grand Ghetto, who'd never even been to Monrovia before, now living alone in apartments in New York without any idea of how to access a service or get a job. And essentially they were alone with their television sets at home during the day, and their primary relationship was with New York television. And some of them really did go mad. There were a couple of cases of people who reported that their television sets were speaking to them. One was admitted to an institution, 2 were sent home. Very serious issues of dislocation in this community. Many, many divorces in this community. Husband and wife would be separated, would reunite on Park Hill Avenue and not be able to make it together in the new life. Very, very high divorce rates in this community. Now, almost everybody in this community experienced the war, and yet, very, very strangely, the war, and particularly people's personal experiences of what happened to them during the war, are a black hole of silence. People do not speak about it. They don't speak about it to neighbors or to strangers, and perhaps most importantly, many people don't speak about it to loved ones and family, which surprised me, which struck me as interesting and disturbing. Let me give you an example. I interviewed a man who lived in Monrovia, said goodbye to his mother one morning, went to the market shopping. And while he was at the markets fighting between ECOMog and Taylor's forces, broke out in his neighborhood and he fled. And about a month later crossed the border into Ivory Coast and became a refugee, leaving his mother at home, who he'd said goodbye to that morning. And he didn't know what had happened to her for 5 years. He was living as a refugee in Ivory Coast, didn't know what had become of his mother or anybody else in his family. Finally arrived in Staten Island in '95, made contact again with his mother in '97, and she came to live with him in Staten Island in '98. Now, while I was interviewing him, I asked him, what happened to your mother during those 5 years where you didn't know where she was? And he said, I don't know where she was. And I said, have you never asked her? And he said, no, we have never ever spoken about those 5 years. It is not a subject of that conversation. It's not something either of us feel capable of talking about. It struck me as quite extraordinary, a family living together and unable to speak about perhaps the most important years of their lives, sort of shuffling around this hole in case they fall in. Another example, there's a Liberian soccer club in Park Hill. In fact, some of you may know the original Monrovian club. It began on 12th Street in Sinkhor, called Rosa. The founder of Rosa found himself in Staten Island and reconstituted this football club. Now, one day in 2007, a reporter from the New York Times came to speak to this football club, this soccer club, and wanted the boys playing soccer to talk about the experience of the war. And at this meeting, a guy in his late 20s stood up and described watching his father being killed before his eyes. His father was disemboweled and broke down and left the room and couldn't finish the story. Now, he'd been playing soccer in the same team for 8 years, and nobody in that room knew the story. It came as an utter surprise to the entire team that this man they knew well and intimately had this experience. It was a bolt from the blue. And very interestingly, when he left the room was filled with tension, first with tension and then with anger. And finally, the coach of the team stood up and said something extremely provocative. He said, never forget that it was Americo-Liberians who did this. They didn't build a single school outside Monrovia, decade after decade. So there's the silence, it's broken, and what emerges is rage and accusation and anger. I mean, that was the immediate response that comes out of the silence. So many thousands of miles away in New York. And perhaps that sort of anger, that outburst of rage is the key to understanding the silence. Because there's something very particular about diaspora communities, or about this particular diaspora community, which is very densely populated, people living together. And that's that people don't know who each other are. Everybody's uprooted from their context. Everybody's living in the same apartment, in the same blue-collar jobs, going to the same school. And one does not know who one's neighbors are, and one doesn't ask for various reasons. One of the reasons you don't ask is because everybody told a story to American immigration officials in order to get to America. And many of those stories are not quite true. And you don't want to quiz somebody too closely about their past, because what if what they tell you is not what they told American immigration officials? What if an enemy gets hold of the story and leads to one's deportation? So the very question of who one was in the past and what one has said in order to get refugee status is very, very loaded, and is considered something that you don't share with anybody you don't trust. It's preferably something you don't share at all. So in that sense, the past is perceived as something quite dangerous to talk about. And another reason, of course, is that you don't know what your neighbor did during the past. I remember at interviewing a woman who was talking about her experience in Monrovia in the 1980s. And she was railing against Samuel Doe and saying terrible things about him. And at one point, somebody around the table got up to go to the bathroom, and somebody said to her, "Do you realize that that man's a crime?" And she broke down in fear and left the room and said, "I didn't know who I was speaking to." So everybody's uprooted. Nobody knows who anybody else is. And that's just another layer, another reason why people don't talk about the past. But, despite this lack of dealing with it, this lack of talking about it, it obviously expresses itself in various ways. And because it's not dealt with directly, people deal with it in very displaced ways, very disguised ways. And one is to look at Liberian youth and see what they're doing on the streets of New York, and through their actions in the present, judging what they did in the past. So, for instance, there's a Liberian street gang in New York. Fights an African-American gang based at the high school down the road. They're called All Black Mob Crew. And it's widely considered that anybody who joins this gang was a soldier back in Liberia. So there's no way of talking what people did in the past, so one really moves the discussion through the present. One looks at how people are becoming New Yorkers, how people are becoming Americans, to talk about what they may or may not have done in the past. And another way in which the past comes back in a very disguised, very displaced form is through the biannual elections for the Staten Island Liberian Community Association, held every 2 years. Every single time that election is held, it breaks down in a fight. One party accuses another party of having rigged the election, of having tried to cheat in the election. 2 years ago, the election ended up in court. This year's election ended up with the police being called in to break up a potentially violent encounter. And inevitably, in the wake of these failed elections, the past comes flooding back, and X is accused of having fought for Taylor, and Y is accused of having been an associate of Bowley, and another person is accused of being close to a rich Liberian who works at Citibank and is meant to be in his pockets and being corrupted by him. So suddenly, at this moment that the community misrepresents itself in a collection, they find that they've spun back into the early 1990s in Liberia and are fighting and talking as if they're still in the Civil War, using the language of the Civil War. It's almost like the incapacity to speak about it has frozen it. They've been frozen in the early 1990s. And suddenly, in 2008, early 1990s, war-torn Liberia reappears, already formed and preserved, on the streets of New York. Now, a community like that surely is very, very relevant to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There are so many things about the past that have not been dealt with, that people really need to deal with. It's an ideal community for really to look at what the TRC is doing and how it deals with this diaspora experience. And the statement-taking process of the TRC has come to Staten Island. I'm sure you all know that it's the advocates for human rights in Minnesota who have been conducting work on behalf of the TRC among the diaspora communities in the United States. And they have outsourced the statement-taking work to a law firm in New York, whose lawyers pro bono are trained to take statements and go into this community in Staten Island to take statements. Now, I would argue that this process, this TRC process in Staten Island, has not been successful. And I want to go through why and what the potential reasons are. There are going to be two prongs to the process. The one is that statement takers do outreach work, try and reach every single Liberian living in the community and take statements from whoever will voluntarily give one, confidential statements. Second process, what was meant to happen, was public. There was meant to be a large town hall meeting in which every Liberian in the community was either present or represented, in which the community could collectively and publicly speak about the past. Now, as for the first process, the statement taking, the last time I counted, about 70 statements had been taken confidentially. And in a community of 4,000, that is very small. As for the public process, this town hall meeting never happened. The community was never really in a position to, in a transparent public forum, speak to one another about the past. So instead what happened is that a live feed was set up to the public hearings in Minnesota, which commissioners here conducted. And that was meant to be a stand-in for a town hall meeting, but only 7 people arrived at that meeting. It was radically under-attended. So I was quite curious to know why a community that is so desperately wrapped up in the past in such a difficult way couldn't engage with the TRC. And one possible reason is, I traveled around with the statement takers every now and again and watched them work, and particularly listened to what they said. They'd knock on people's doors, somebody would open up. The statement takers are Americans, they're American lawyers. And they would say, "We are here on behalf of your country's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Do you want to talk about what happened to you in the past? It's entirely confidential. And the reason is, number one, it may help you to heal. And number two, it's going to go into a record. The TRC is going to write a narrative history of what happened in your country, and do you want to add your voice to that history?" That's what was explained. And generally people said no, or very politely closed the door, or not so politely closed the door, but generally people didn't want to do that. And I was thinking of what was left out of that briefing, what the statement takers didn't say. They didn't mention reparations at all. They didn't mention amnesty and what sort of process the TRC was going through in terms of perpetrators, in terms of the guilty. Those things were not spoken of at all. And I suspect that people were a little insulted. Essentially they were told that telling the truth about your personal history is good for you. So do it because you will heal. But no talk about justice. No talk about the foundations on which the Liberian settlement is being built. So I suspect that there was a problem in the delivery of the statement takers, in what they chose to say and what they didn't. And perhaps the fact that they were Americans and not Liberians, or not very well briefed about the TRC in the process, that could have been part of it. So I think that people recoiled because they sensed that what was happening didn't have sufficient substance. They wanted to know the foundations of the new order, where justice came in, where reparations came in, where amnesty came in. And I'd go to people afterwards and say, "Well, tell me why you wouldn't testify." And they'd say, "Why should I testify when the president isn't testifying? When in 1990 did she stop supporting Taylor?" Almost everybody said that. That's a question everybody asks in that community. People get obsessed with particular questions. That's one of them. Or people will say, why is only one person in the war being brought to justice, Charles Taylor, and why for what he did in another country? You know, people say, I want those questions answered before I give my testimony. So they're asking for an explanation and for a substantive process. And at risk of getting distracted, I just want to talk briefly and finally to a broader question very much related to this, and which brings in my South African experience. I mean, George Wachira said something very interesting in his presentation yesterday. He said that until truth commissions came to Africa, they were considered a second best. They were considered something that you do when justice isn't possible, when amnesty is a given, when you need to get the truth, despite the fact that the best wasn't available. And what happened in South Africa is that was turned around, and a truth commission was considered something better than a classical war tribunal or a criminal justice process. And I think it's quite important to dissect how South Africa got to that conclusion, because I think that it was maybe fooling itself a little bit. You know, what happened in South Africa is that in the early 1990s, there was a multi-party negotiation process that wrote an interim constitution, and there were 16 parties involved. But behind closed doors, on the side, the two main parties, the African National Congress and the apartheid government, were meeting secretly alongside this broader process. And in those secret talks, the apartheid government told the ANC that the transition could not go ahead unless there was amnesty. That was a fundamental, non-negotiable condition of the transition happening at all. And for various reasons, the ANC readily agreed and said there will be no war tribunals, there will be no prosecution, there will be amnesty. That was decided in secret. It only really came out some years later. And that was the basis on which the TRC was formed. You know, Tutu was not involved in deciding whether there'd be amnesty. None of the truth commissioners were involved in deciding whether there could be amnesty. That was a secretly negotiated condition of the whole transition. And I think that what people like Tutu did was try to make the best of it. Try to say, we are not a vengeful people, that's why we have amnesty. We are not looking for revenge, that's why we have amnesty. What we're doing is something better. We're going to get truth and we're going to get reconciliation because we are able to heal, because we are better than a criminal justice process. And that may be true, but I think it was based on a misperception. It was based on the idea that we were doing this because it was the moral high road, because it was the best thing to do and we'd freely chosen it. And that was never true. And I don't think the South African people were deceived ever, about that sleight of hand. I think that most people knew that justice had been suspended, maybe necessarily, but pragmatically, not in principle. It was a pragmatic decision to suspend justice in order for democracy to come to South Africa. And I really think that what these Liberian people in Park Hill Avenue were telling me was the same thing. You know, they were saying, we understand that compromises needed to be made in order for this war to end. We understand that you can't have a fully fledged war tribunal, and the settlement must, go forward in the foundation that it has. But you must be honest with us about it. We need to know what the compromises were and why they were made. We need to be treated with that sort of seriousness. And I think that the way the content of the commission was translated over the ocean as it went, into the hands of an NGO and into the hands of pro bono lawyers, a lot of that content was filtered out and didn't actually get to the people from whose statements were being asked for. So, I mean, for me, at the broadest level, that's the lesson I take away. It's really that for public participation to work, people need to be treated with great seriousness and need to be engaged about the fundamentals, about the foundations of this settlement, why it happened, if justice is suspended, why it's necessary. Those things have to be answered honestly. I don't think that they can be escaped. And that's it. Thank you very much.